It's time for episode 83 of The Crisis Show here on Google Hangouts, on YouTube, on Twitter, and wherever else you have this link around the world. Tonight, we're going to talk about two major stories. First, the Secret Service and the resignation of its director late this afternoon, Julia Pearson. And then we're going to talk about Ebola. As many of you know by now, there's a patient in critical condition in a hospital in Texas. So we're going to look at crisis management around this case, which has affected many organizations and many government officials in Texas and beyond. Good evening from New York. My name is Rich Klein. I'm president of Rich Klein Crisis Management. And we've been doing the show since June 2012. And I want to introduce my two esteemed guests and colleagues right now. First of all, from the West Third Group, operating out of Las Vegas, Nevada, someone who's doing a lot of global business, particularly in China, Greg Brooks. How are you, Greg?
Great to be here, Rich. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Good to have you back. And another person who's been with us before. He is someone out of the greater Philadelphia area. He's a vice president at Kimball Communications. You can find him at Kimball PR on Twitter. Rod Hughes. Hi, Rod. How are you?
I'm good, Rich. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Great. And this is a good team here. So, guys, a lot happened today. I have to tell you, just as an aside, very often I decide on the topics for the show, late in the day, very often too late, but late in the morning, day of the show. And today I decided on the Secret Service story as well as the Ebola story. And then, of course, in the last 2 hours, we find out about the resignation of Julia Pearson, the head of the Secret Service, who, of course, as we all know, was on the hot seat before Congress this week. I guess a lot of people didn't like her answers, but what really happened from news reports is this latest incident in which President Obama was apparently on an elevator with an armed person, and that did not get reported to the president. It came out to the White House and his administration just moments before it hit the press. It may have been the Washington Post, which has done a great job on this story. So, gentlemen, talk to me about how this resignation. We'll start with the latest news, of course. Talk to me about the resignation, and is this enough? Does it go far enough? Is it going to, or is this going to be a slow change of a culture that's been a problem for many years? Greg, let me call on you first on this.
Well, the resignation solves an immediate political problem. In Washington, there's nothing ever so urgent as the siren cry of something must be done. Okay, something was done. We got a senior level official canned. But as Rod and I were discussing pre-show, that doesn't even begin to touch upon the culture, the embedded problems, the depth of the problems. We don't know if these were two high-profile and ugly isolated incidents, or if this sort of thing happens regularly. And frankly, we don't know if the problem is embedded in other aspects of the Secret Service's work. So, no, I don't believe this is the period at the end of the sentence. I think this is a comma before some of the voices get louder.
I don't even know if we've gotten to the comma, Greg. This is, I think, symbolic of a bigger problem within the organization that's been going on for a number of years now, where there is a systemic cultural problem with making sure that they are the agents of the Secret Service are properly protecting the president, doing their job. As you mentioned earlier, they do a lot more than just protect the president of the United States. But this is an issue where we also have a situation where this is very much symbolic. It's very much political theater, because it's the equivalent of the bike racks that they've now surrounded the White House, like they're doing something. But in fact, they haven't. They've cut off the head, but the body is still moving. And we have a situation where the folks who are most directly involved in the errors that have been taking place over a series of years, those are the folks I'd like to hear about. Those are the folks I'd like to know, I'd like to hear from with regard to follow up on Ms. Pearson's promise from yesterday that this will never happen again. Well, tell me how. That's what I think the American public needs to hear right now. Tell me how.
Yeah, what struck me, guys, is and I'm just showing you a little bit of the statement from Jay Johnson, the head of Homeland Security, when he released a statement earlier today. What I want to talk about was interesting to me from, and Greg, you put this very well in our pre-show about CEO type of training about making decisions. In this case, it seemed to me it was the pressure by not from what we were expected from the Republicans and Fox News, but this time from many people in President Obama's own party were calling for the resignation. In fact, I heard late today that Chuck Schumer was about to have a news conference to do just that, and of course, it became a moot point. Greg, do you think that had something to do with this final decision that was made to ask for her resignation? Of course, they call it a resignation, but we all know it was something very different.
Yeah, it's resignation might be the most polite way to put it.
Exactly.
I do think there's a bigger work here at play, and I think that it's even broader than what you're saying. We have certainly before 9/11, but definitely in the post 9/11 era, we have as a body politic decided that there is zero acceptable level of risk for public political figures and groups of the public. An individual death is still tolerated no matter how shocking, but a group of deaths at the hands of terrorists, we are willing as a society to spend trillions of dollars to stop that. And that attitude has given us the Department of Homeland Security, and it's given us an organizational culture, to get back to Rod's word, that says, okay, well, we're not punished when we fail, and we're rewarded when we throw more spaghetti at the wall. And so I think that the reflexive institutional response of the Secret Service in this string of failures has been probably one of, well, we're going to have more procedures, we're going to inconvenience more Americans, we're going to have more agents, we're going to expand our budget, everything except actually doing the job better.
Right.
Well, Greg, if they make me take my shoes off to better protect the president, that's where I draw the line. But I will say this, just to piggyback on what you're saying, we're in an election cycle, midterms, everybody's fighting for their political survival, and Democrats in particular can never afford to look soft on crime or soft on security. So I think it was inevitable. I'm actually surprised, to be perfectly honest, that Julia Pearson made it through to mid-afternoon today. Regardless of the elevator, the incident with the gentleman in the elevator, when this happened, I fully expected that she would be assisted in writing her resignation letter. I'm surprised she made it. Adding that elevator incident, Democrats could not, in good conscience, especially those up for re-election this midterm cycle, could not stand by idly and fail to call for her resignation.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Rich, go ahead.
I just want to go back for a moment what we talked about in the pre-show as well, which is the idea of Julia Pearson not revealing that this incident, probably some of the other incidents, particularly the contractor incident in Atlanta, which, by the way, was very ironic because the president was in Atlanta to talk at the CDC about Ebola. So here we are with the stories. But what was interesting to me about this is that it took that situation to result in her resignation. And the media reports are saying that the president just learned about this armed person right before it hit the media, and that may have been the final straw for the resignation. And we've talked in the pre-show, maybe for the benefit of our viewers, some of our views about how transparent do you have to be to the public when you make mistakes, and how much of it should just be kept internal in this situation?
Well, from my perspective, I think honesty is almost always the best policy, but I won't take the words out of Greg's mouth, but I do think where security is concerned, especially security for high state officials in this country and others, there needs to be some moderation in what information is shared and what isn't. But you have to make early on which direction you're going to go in. Are you going to be transparent, or are you going to, cling to executive privilege or security issues? And whichever way you go, you need to commit to it, and you need to make sure that that information is passed up and down the line so that everyone is speaking with the same voice.
Greg,
I think that's wise counsel. I do think that, as Rod alluded to, there are times and places, particularly in the political realm, when transparency is just not gonna realistically cut it.
Mm-hmm.
But the public is remarkably sensitive and reacts strongly to direct, honest language. You don't have to be transparent to the degree that we might counsel in a corporate setting in order to say, we've screwed up, and we've screwed up a couple of times,
Mm-hmm.
and we have one job right now: protect the president, and that means fixing this. And that's sort of direct language. If I may add another point, we're talking about how Pearson, failed and was shoved out the door. I think political appointees all have two jobs, one of which they very seldom get to do. The job they seldom get to do is transform the division or department or agency that they're put in charge of. And this is an example of that, and an example of why turnaround of government agencies is so hard. But the other job that they all have by default is they're the firewall to be fired or mocked or yelled at by Congress in order to keep the president himself from looking bad or foolish. And I think that if we're going to acknowledge Pearson's failures, I think we need to acknowledge that she executed that part of her job correctly. I mean, you're always a lamb up for sacrifice at that
Mm-hmm.
level.
right?
I would completely agree. I think she held herself very well during the press conference, and in her defense, she is being hung out to dry in part for circumstances that occurred prior to her. I believe it was March 2013 that when she was appointed to her position.
Right.
The 2011 shooting at the White House, the incident a few years ago with the Secret Service, the advance team engaging with prostitutes. Those all predated her service as head of the Secret Service. However, she knew what she was getting into when she accepted the position in March of 2013, and I believe in a situation like that, if you don't have a plan to succeed quickly, given the incidents that have led up to your appointment, that is actually a plan to fail fairly quickly.
Yeah.
That's well put.
Yeah. Yeah, I think also, like any CEO position, any leadership position, you're only as good as your people around you are as well. I didn't get into that level of detail. Not only you have to have the support, but they have to be enthusiastic and gung ho to, and especially in this case when you're putting your life on the line. My gosh, this kind of job, enthusiastically embrace your leader. And give them the respect they deserve. And I don't know those details, but certainly it's a factor in any crisis management leadership situation. I think that has to be taken into account. I just don't know those details. So
we've actually got a good example. If you have to go back several decades to find it, but the Army had a tremendous problem in the 70s. Coming out of Vietnam, there were these wilderness years before the early 80s, where the Army had tremendous problems with discipline, with procedure not being followed, with infractions, including criminal infractions, and they turned their entire culture around. So it is possible for a government agency, even one as large and slow-moving as the Army, to turn around. I wonder if there aren't some academic studies out there looking at that and some lessons that could be applied.
Interesting.
Well, I think this will definitely, at some point, become a study in turnaround management failure, and hopefully we learn something from it.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, just to close the loop on it, what made it hard, I guess, for Julia Pierce is that this was the reason she was brought into the job, was to clean up. And she couldn't clean it up, and then the subsequent incidents, I don't know what else they could have done. So, and certainly, Greg, as you pointed out very appropriately in our pre-show, the point about the administration not communicating well on this at all on the same day, I think is what you said.
Yeah, well, in the morning they had complete confidence in Miss Pearson, and by the time her resignation was announced, the spokespeople were softballing their answers in such a way as to make it apparent that the administration was very fed up.
Yeah.
What a
Yeah.
difference a lunch makes.
Yeah. Well, it's like, it's interesting that I think the president or a spokesperson said, the president stands by the Secret Service. Of course, the laugh that I got out of my head today was, well, the guy in the elevator was also standing by the president, and that was not a good thing. So, anyway, hopefully they'll get that straightened out. Oh, just one other thought that I had on this, guys, a little bit related to the Secret Service situation is, watching I think it was yesterday or the day before, one of the cable networks was showing the outline of the White House, the guy who got through, and they're pointing out exactly where he ran to. First he was here, then he was here, then he was in the East Room, all that detail. Then he was tackled, but was that too much information for security reasons, do you guys think, or was that helpful? Was that an example of good transparency, or could that backfire because now you're giving away some real holes in security in the White House? Certainly, the terrorists have to be watching that.
From my perspective, you can get a map of the White House in any souvenir shop. So it's
right.
I don't think the map itself
Right.
Opened it up to new risks or expanded risks. But I will say
the holes in the security is what I'm talking about. No, I agree with you.
As far as holes in the security, I think they just overshared. That was information that did not need to be shared, and it goes back to Greg's point earlier. You can be honest, but you don't have to be. In certain circumstances, transparency is not the best policy.
Yeah, I personally thought that was way too much detail, and I don't have in front of me where it originated from. Maybe it was a source, maybe it was from a press briefing, but I just thought that was bad judgment. They had plenty to say without giving away that level of the holes in the security system there. And by the way, I thought one of the congressmen cracked me up when he held up the sign of ADT security at home. He says, "This is what I use." Have you guys thought about that? So, go ahead.
We have varied by administration in terms of how much we apparently seek out the press's approval in revealing measures and processes for security. But the real example in this, go look at how the Israeli government talks with the media about what their capabilities are and what their methods and sources are. They have very clean lines, and there's no amount of crisis wherein they cross those lines. There's no political crisis so great that it's worth giving up the value of those secrets remaining secret.
Yeah, and that's a great example, Greg. And having worked for a Jewish organization or two in my life, which very often had Israeli security, I learned from that. And you're exactly right. And that was probably what prompted my thinking on this as well, because I do pay attention to that. So thank you for raising that. Okay. Does anything else on the Secret Service matter before we move on? Anything else you guys want to add? Okay. So, folks, our next story, as we mentioned in our opening, is this situation in Texas in which a man got off the plane last week from Liberia, went to, I think it's called Texas Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas. He had symptoms, I guess, of some kind of virus or cold. He saw the nurse and reportedly mentioned that he did, in fact, just get off the plane from Liberia. They apparently sent him home, and the further reports pointed out that the information for the admitting nurse never reached the doctors. So this man was sent home, and a lot of people are saying, at least in the media and social media, that this could have been the risk to these 5 children this man apparently came in contact with might have been negated had they taken this more seriously. So, having said that, I mean, they certainly have their own. First of all, the hospital, like any hospital would, has a crisis when somebody enters your hospital and is diagnosed with Ebola. But they have a further situation because they missed the ball on this one. However, they've done a good job, I think, in communicating when they when the word got out that this person was at the hospital. They had a press conference, and I want to just run a little bit of the video from that news conference yesterday right now and get you guys' thought on this. And I haven't watched it yet myself, but I just thought it'd be good to know.
The Federal Centers for Disease Control has confirmed that a patient admitted to this hospital has tested positive for Ebola virus, the cause of Ebola virus disease. The hospital has been and is following all the CDC and the Texas Department of Health recommendations to protect the safety of our patients, our medical and other staff, volunteers, physicians, and visitors. We're working closely with representatives from the Centers for Disease Control, the Texas Department of Health and Human Services, the Dallas County Department of Health and Human Services, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services on a coordinated response, and we're taking every step possible to manage this situation. If you have other questions, there is a website which is www.texashorthealth.org, which will have access and links for questions that you might have in writing.
Texas Health Dallas has a robust infection control system, and our staff is trained and prepared to take care of patients with a variety of infectious diseases, including Ebola virus disease. An epidemiologic emergency policy is in place at the hospital, and infection prevention and emergency management are working closely together to stay abreast of ongoing developments. The hospital is operating as normal, with clinicians caring for patients and other hospital employees supporting those caregivers as they do every day.
The patient has been in appropriate isolation, which according to CDC is called contact isolation and droplet precautions, since they arrived for this admission on Sunday. Our staff is thoroughly trained in infection control procedures and protocols, and we have been meeting literally for weeks in anticipation of such an event.
The purpose of hospitals is to care for the sick and the injured and the ill, and to advance knowledge about health and well-being. At Texas Health, our training, our emergency preparedness, our dedication, and our focus on safety and quality, essentially everything we do is in preparation to handle these types of cases.
Okay, I think
It's important to note that
I'll just pause it there. Was that like an anchor team or a rabbi and a cantor? Did I miss something in the editing there? It was like this guy's talking, and then he had perfectly timed. Okay, you're going to start here. I haven't seen that before.
It was seamless.
So, initial thoughts, Rod, on their content.
As a PR guy, I will say there was a lot of good messaging. There were a couple of statements in there that just made me cringe. Part of the problem is they are overemphasizing the fact that they have been prepared for this. Everything they do is about safety, and they've been preparing for weeks, and yet they sent the patient home.
Right.
So they lose a little bit of credibility right off the bat.
Right.
I think if they had addressed the situation as a communication error, which happens in any healthcare organization or business organization, people can forgive that. But you can't reassure people that you've been preparing for this, that your staff is trained to handle it, you've done everything you can, when you sent the patient home. And again, it was a minor error. The information didn't transfer from the admitting nurse to the clinicians who were evaluating the case. This can happen. But I think that needed to be addressed up front. Short of that, I think the messaging was good. So they've got two situations now. They have a local community health organization that screwed up communications crisis, and how did this happen? And I'm sure as time goes on, we'll be talking about that a little bit more. Every regional media outlet in the country is going to be asking if this can happen here and what are the steps and protocols in place in your local hospital. But you also have the bigger story, which, as we talked about in the pre-show, has the possibility to be that textbook case of how you handle a medical crisis. They are now that they have properly identified this gentleman they are taking all the proper steps, or so it would appear thus far. And I think given the healthcare infrastructure in this country, you're going to see that this has a very different outcome from West Africa. But they're still at some point going to have to deal with that initial snafu, I guess for lack of a better term, and any litigation that may result from that.
Greg, thoughts on that? What you just saw?
Well, Rob has it exactly right. There are multiple things playing out here. The genuine organizational crisis is with the hospital that screwed up, and they now have to decide, ideally in consultation with their attorneys and their communications professionals, how they're going to communicate about this moving forward. What we don't have is a public health crisis. We have one guy with an infection and an overactive media. In a genuine public health crisis, whether it's via Ebola or a bioterrorism agent, the thinking for the last 10 years or so in the communications and care communities has evolved toward, no, our big challenges will be the underserved communities. Who are the people who are not watching CNN? Who are the people who don't trust the government messaging? And those are going to be your riskiest infection vectors. I did a project a few years ago for the state of Kentucky, where the tough nut to crack are these poor Appalachian communities that they're living at not just poverty level, but some of them at starvation level, but they won't take government cheese because they don't trust the government. Well, guess what? They're not going to trust the government's messaging about Ebola either. So,
right.
I
just want to add a side here for our viewers' benefit as well. When you have this is an interesting example to me because this is a crisis. Let me back up. You have a patient that comes to your hospital, right? I mean, crisis situations can very often be golden opportunities to shine. So from the moment this man checked into the ER, let's just say hypothetically for a moment that they didn't screw up and they did everything by the book and he was immediately diagnosed and cared for. Man, the publicity for that hospital would have been amazing. Right?
Wouldn't you want to stay at a hospital that can cope with this level of crisis?
Exactly.
They demonstrated that they're a cut above.
Exactly. It would have done wonders. I mean, I'm not familiar with the Texas healthcare system of this hospital in particular, but as a general, observer, when you first hear this person was diagnosed in this hospital, and then it's a shame for a lot of reasons, obviously, that this person they had this mistake here, obviously, but crisis situations like this can be really opportunities to shine and to really take your reputation to the next level. So for those of you watching, don't always think because you have a potential crisis it has to stay that way. It can be an opportunity. Unfortunately, Texas Presbyterian and this mistake probably made by one or two people in the in the ER that really screwed it up for them. So I just want to make that point here that these are often opportunities to take your reputation to a much higher level than ever been. So, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right. I think that how they comport themselves over the next weeks and months is crucial. As we were saying pre-show, it may turn out with the rise of contract physicians that the breakdown in communications didn't even occur with an employee. Does the organization then take responsibility, or do they try and throw another individual or another company under the bus? We've seen some blowback from something very similar to that just this week. Walmart, in its testimony to the court in the case of the driver who fell asleep and injured the actor Tracy Morgan, Walmart is catching a lot of heat for offering up as an affirmative defense the fact that Mr. Morgan didn't have his seatbelt on.
Yeah,
and unfortunately, in that case, the media is running pictures of the limousine bus that Mr. Morgan was injured in, and anyone who's looking at that picture is recognizing that while a seatbelt may have minimized his injuries, it certainly would not have stopped the crash.
Right.
Yeah, certainly. that was an attorney decision, and the corporate communications people at Walmart didn't think about the ramifications of that for sure. Yeah, some story. You know, one of the things that is so interesting here is about this situation in Texas is that there are multiple agencies, multiple spokespeople. You have the CDC, you have the hospital, you have leaders in Dallas, Dallas County Health Department, State of Texas Health Department. A lot of messaging going out. I think Governor Rick Perry today had a news conference and was talking about the 5 school children. That led to a statement from the Dallas school superintendent. So you really have this, you know, folks out there listening, whenever there's a crisis in one place, don't think that, well, it's them, not me, because there's very often this domino effect. Something's happening across town or with an agency. You may not even think it's going to touch you, and then all of a sudden it's on your doorstep. So it's really important, whatever community you live in, big city or small town, to pay attention to breaking news for that reason, because you may be surprised how fast a story changes, information dribbles out. Next thing you know, you're being asked the same questions, right? So what are the challenges do you guys think right now with these multiple organizations and officials talking about this Ebola situation?
Well, I think the primary challenge is that some, and I could not tell you what percentage, but I think some of these agencies have no business talking about it right now. What they should do is instead of saying, well, I have to look to my constituents or my special interest group or the people who voted for me and make them feel like they're being helped, instead the correct response, I believe, is to coordinate up the food chain. And have, you know, if all of the communications were coming from the governor, the CDC, and perhaps the Dallas County Health and Human Services folks you have up on the screen right now, that's 3 sources. That's plenty. Now, is that realistic? Probably not. Everybody, you know, but the reflexive urge that no, we must do something, we must say something, in multi-jurisdictional environments often muddies the communication water rather than clear it.
Yeah, you know, I think that's a great point, because certainly, and Greg, I know you've worked in politics as I have, and worked with, you know, government officials. It can get down to the micro level where you're having you know, local council people and state legislators feeling like they have to issue a statement or have a news conference to get to weigh in, because they're worried about the risk if they don't say something, right, that they're going to be looked at, well, they don't care. So there's always that weighing of political opportunity as well. Rod, you want to jump in on that?
I completely agree. I think, as Greg stated earlier, the appropriate approach would have been the CDC, the either state or local health department, and the hospital giving a joint statement or the state and CDC health departments giving a joint statement after the hospital. Once you've got political figures, once you've got you know, local constituencies jumping into the mix, it does muddy the waters. But I will say one of the things that we talked about a little bit pre-show that I think is indicative of a smart response is all of these organizations are making good use of their social media presences. They're tweeting out helpful, informative information. They're sharing links to how Ebola is spread, what Ebola is. They're sharing information that really touches people where they live. They're on their social media presences. You've got the Texas Health Resources Facebook page up here from the Healthcare Administration. You've got a lot of information going out via Twitter. So,
by the way, this is the hospital website. It's a conglomerate, which I just found out like an hour ago. Yeah, it's tough to find. Yeah.
But they're sharing good, helpful information. What I would criticize them on, and one thing that I did see from the Dallas healthcare organization, the Dallas Health, the county organization, thank you, on their Twitter feed was they were tweeting updates about how the patient was being cared for without identifying the patient. I don't think that level of detail, to go back to our earlier discussion, is necessary. I think at this point, given the fact that it is one patient, that that patient is isolated and that it's being obviously very carefully monitored, I would say the focus at this point should really be informational from the organizations managing the crisis. And let's leave it to CNN and Fox News to run wild with speculation and minute detail.
Yeah, go ahead, Greg. After you, I'll go after you. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I suspect all three of us have been in the position where we've said to clients in a crisis or at the edge of a crisis, do nothing right now. Wait. And I don't know about you two, but I've been given harsh pushback, loud pushback, saying, I'm not paying you to tell me to do nothing. And sometimes what you have to have the backbone to say as consultants. Certainly, you have to say, the most valuable advice I'm giving you is to do nothing. What you choose to do with that advice is up to you. I feel sorry, Frank, for employees who are stuck in a situation where there is no path other than doing what the agitated elected official or department head says.
Right.
I completely agree. I think we've all been there. And one of the things that you have to remind those organizations that you work with is they have engaged you for your expertise. And if what they choose to do with that expertise is up to them, but ultimately you have to strenuously advocate for the best position and the best interests of the client you're working for. Yeah. What they do with it is up to them.
Good point. I want to just circle back for a moment to this conversation about these multiple spokespeople, because it occurred to me that in a situation like this, if I was advising one of these major organizations, let's say hospital or health department, what I tell clients is that you really need to develop these kinds of relationships with your colleagues in other agencies and other businesses long before a crisis hits, because right now you have these varied voices. You got the CDC, as I said, the county health, the governor, and so forth. But the time to think about what would we do? I mean, this is what emergency management does when they have these exercises. This is what tabletop crisis communications exercises are for, so that faced with a situation like this, how can we work together? Who's going to do what? Who's going to pull the strings to get the resources we need on the ground? Who's going to be our spokespeople? And if that person's not available, who's going to be our backup spokespeople? And who's going to say what? These are the things that all three of us I know have worked on with clients and multiple clients. But for our viewers' benefit, this is something really important to think about long before a crisis hits. And one of the things that I find in my business is that I get the call, and I know you guys do as well. I got a call, just a few weeks ago from a client, literally at the 11th hour. It was like 11:30 on a Sunday night, saying we're in a pickle. You need to help us. From a business standpoint, that's great. But I did say, I wish you would have called me 2 weeks ago. We could have nipped this in the bud, and you wouldn't have half the problem you have. So people get in this head in the sand mentality when they don't think about this planning for the worst. And this is a good example. This situation in Dallas, I think, is a good example of getting your colleagues together, thinking about if you're in business, for example, think about who else can help you. Let's say if there was a fire or an explosion or workplace violence incident in your office, who can I call upon to help us and my employees get through this? Where can we go to set up our offices if we need to? Just things you have to think about. I usually make a checklist for clients. Those clients that are smart enough to think about this usually do better when that crisis hits, and no matter how bad it is, because they've lined up the things they need to do. So, guys, I would love for you to add some of your tips along these lines, if you would. Maybe share some war stories like I just did as well.
Well, I think in terms of this situation, I would hope that coordination and that planning is already there. We've been through swine flu. We've been through situations like Katrina, where you've got very specific geographic crises that need to be managed through multiple organizations. So, having worked with a few hospitals and healthcare systems myself, typically these situations, in terms of how they'll coordinate, who will talk, who won't talk, and how they'll lay this information out, is usually fairly coordinated. That said, we find ourselves very much post-swine flu in a heavily saturated media market. We find ourselves in a heavily saturated social media market. And I think, going back to Greg's point earlier, I don't think it's a lack of coordination. So far, what I've seen from these organizations, while everyone has got their stake in the ground, so far the information seems to be substantive, it seems to be helpful, everyone's trying to get their CNN FaceTime, but for the most part, it seems like no one is contradicting anyone as of yet.
Yeah,
so I think they've got that down.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even if they're speaking separately, they are pretty much sticking to the same message. And by the way, I think CDC is doing a great job.
They are.
You know, and one of the things I just want to add to that is what we always say in this business is, you know, actions speak louder than words. Or before you speak the words, make sure you're taking the right actions or the right corrective actions. So in this case, the CDC, by sending a team of 7 people very quickly into Dallas, much like the transportation safety people go investigate an accident, doing that quickly gives you a lot of credibility. That you get the resources on the ground, so you're not just talking the talk. You said, you know what, and they, in fact, on the CDC website, they made a point of that, that they did send that team, which I think was very smart PR. Greg, go ahead and get you in here on this. Anything?
No, I was just going to say that that coordination level that Rod mentioned, it's always existed in regional planning, regional emergency management, and in the healthcare system, but sometimes it was weak. And it is consistently stronger now across the board nationwide, due in a large part to Homeland Security funding. Homeland Security pumped a lot of money into metro areas and into states over the last decade, specifically on the basis of, here's a grant, go prepare for a major bioterror event, and or go prepare for a major terrorism event. And a lot of states and a lot of metro areas have used that money to develop these thick, robust plans of exactly the type that we're seeing executed. At least I assume there's a plan being executed in Dallas right now.
Yeah, it's like sending a tank to Ferguson, right? So,
right.
Yeah. So that was part of, I think that was the same funding. Anyway, what I want to do now is, because I, just to further our conversation on this, is I'm pulling up a clip from Rick Perry's press conference. Let me just see if I can pull that up here. This may be a partial clip. Okay, let me just play that for you guys and get some thoughts, because this really goes to leadership. Governors, I think, are great crisis management examples, and how they perform, I think, is important. So let me just let's go to the videotape. Hold on, pull that up. This looks like a feed from the one of the. Oh, lost some audio here. Let me get the audio up here.
We're working very closely with the local, both the city and the county health officials as well in this very serious case as we partner. As you know, a patient was admitted to this hospital on September the 28th, subsequently tested positive for Ebola. Today we learned that some school-age children have been identified as having had contact with the patient and are now being monitored at home for any signs of the disease. I know that parents are being extremely concerned about that development, but let me assure these children have been identified and they are being monitored, and the disease cannot be transmitted before having any symptoms. I have full confidence in the medical professionals, in Superintendent Miles, in our local, our state, and our federal partners in keeping this contained. This is a disease that is not airborne and is substantially more difficult to contract than the common cold. We have experts here with us today who will be talking to you in a minute about the precautions you may want to take. The medical community of North Texas, along with officials from the state and federal government, have been working together to take every step available and necessary to care for this patient's health and to ensure the safety and welfare of our citizens. There are few places in the world better equipped to meet the challenge that is posed in this case.
Okay. Greg, go ahead.
You know, I'm going to start with the least substantial criticism in the world.
Is Ty? Okay.
I,
By the way.
either Perry's media people are fools, or the Texas health system is a huge supporter of the Perry campaign. Because if I'm Rick Perry, I'm not sure I'm going to have my photo shot that long with Texas health system logos behind me until we knew the extent of this.
Tell me why, Greg. Tell me why, for our viewers' benefit. I think I get it, but share with me why.
Because we are just a few findings and a few infections away from that entire brand being destroyed by this.
Right. So an alternative. Let me ask you a question. That's a really valid point. I appreciate that. So what would you have done? Had him at the executive office and have him? It should have been on his turf and have them come there. What would you have done if anything differently?
I think if he's there, he understands the power of having his office represented along with these other spokespeople. It is a gesture of public support and public calming. I get that. It would have been no problem at all for Perry to be rushed and to have a scheduling conflict and have to make his comments before everybody else, perhaps outside in front of the building or something like that. And as I said, that's an insubstantial comment as long as things don't blow up. If things blow up, you know, that photo it's not noble.
That's political.
That photo could be it could be the end of his
political advertisement if he runs for president. Right.
Well, it's mission accomplished if things aren't accomplished.
Right. Good point. Yes, it is. Well, you're doing a heck of a job, Brownie. You know, standing in New Orleans, right? Yeah, and by the way, just for our viewers' benefit, I have to correct myself. I didn't know this was a joint news conference, so you know, this was what we were talking about as a show of unity, and your point's well taken, Greg. But certainly, I think at this, if you take away the governor here, you certainly still could have had Tom Friedan, the CDC director here. You could have had the state and county officials with the hospital, right? That would not have been a problem as much, right?
Yeah, I like Tom, and I would stick Tom in front of the camera all day on situations like this because he seems congenitally unable to smile, and I don't think anybody needs to be smiling while we're talking about this issue. So he's a great lead.
He is good. And talk to me about Perry's delivery here, his presentation skills.
Lacking, but I don't think anybody is surprised by that.
Yeah, I've seen it before, which is why I asked the question. Yeah. It just comes across as unsure and weak.
Well, my deeper concern, if I'm Rick Perry's communications person, is to your point, Rich, earlier. They could have this press conference. They could give the governor's speech to anyone and not lose anything. So, A, does it diminish the office and the man by having him there? B, why are we taking healthcare information from the governor? I believe he's against government health care, last time I checked. So I don't necessarily know that if I'm going to be taking my medical advice on how to avoid Ebola from any government official. I think that information, his speech should have been more substantial. I would have liked to have heard what the governor's office is doing to coordinate with the CDC and the state and local officials. That, I think, would have been meaningful, substantive, and would have made him look like a governor. Instead, I think he looks like a hospital official.
Great point. I tend to agree with what you said. It's really you raised my interest on that. Greg,
your point's all the more interesting given how in a red state, Perry runs an especially deep shade of red, and his speech was very government as caring parent, government as don't worry, we got this, citizens.
Right.
And I would love to see one of those awful Frank Luntz instant focus groups. I would love to see what real world Texas Republicans or Texas Perry supporters, to keep it from being party specific, thought of that speech. Are they so rattled and scared that suddenly it's okay to sound Big Brotherish and the government's got this?
Well, and just to add more fuel to the fire, when Governor Perry was talking about the confidence he has in the individuals, and then he's looking down at his notes to figure out the gentleman's name or the woman's name, that does not inspire confidence. It's a presentation thing. I give the governor credit in so much as this is an evolving situation. You've got to react quickly, and he's not the best at thinking on his feet. But I will say,
he admittedly has brain freezes. I think in one of the debates.
He does. You know, he can't remember that third department he wants to eliminate. But I would say this: when you're trying to instill confidence in the public and let them know that they have the best possible medical care, you can't come across as wishy-washy. Either commit to it or don't say it and let others speak for you.
Yeah. Very interesting. I think also what I want to talk about, guys, is this, this new world we live in with the social media, and so much of what the public digests, if you will. Yes, they get it from the cable networks. Yes, they get it from the daily newspapers. But so much of this news and opinion, of course, is on Twitter. And how do you guys in your working environments dealing with crisis management, how do you guys advise clients on the use of social media in a crisis? I mean, I'm looking right now at the CDC website, Twitter feed, by the way, which and their latest tweet is interesting. Get answers to your questions on the first Ebola case in the U.S. from CDC experts, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, use CDC chat, and then they have a link to this. So they're actually going to do a Twitter chat about Ebola to educate the public, which I think is a great use of social media.
It is.
Yeah. So how do you guys deal with, advising clients about getting a message out in this world today where, sometimes the media may not listen to you, sometimes the media may not agree with you. Are you better off sometimes going directly to your audiences through social media? And I ask you that as a general question, but maybe some tips for our audience as well.
Well, I think from a messaging standpoint in the midst of a crisis, social media is the opportunity to get the message out that you want the public to have. So to go back to the conversation with Greg earlier about transparency and honesty and what is that mix, you have to decide what's the most important message that your audiences need to hear from you when your organization is in crisis. Is it full transparency and sharing all the information that's available, or is it basically taking the Big Brother approach of we've got a problem, we acknowledge it, we're taking steps to address it, and we'll have more information for you later. Basically the classic holding statement.
Exactly.
I think that's where social media in the immediate event of a crisis is really helpful. And I think after the fact, it's a way to, just as the CDC is doing now, to educate people, whether it's about a fire, a flood, one of your executives has been caught up in a scandal. It's a way to demonstrate that you're taking a thoughtful approach to it. But each instance is different.
Yeah, by the way, the CDC Twitter feed, the one I'm looking at, they have a few. This one's called CDC Emergency, 1.58 million followers. So certainly a big following, and I think you certainly have to take that into account whenever you're posting something on social media. Who's going to be listening? Who's going to be watching? And do you know how to use the proper communications channels? Do you have the right hashtag to get into a conversation if it's a crisis involving your company or your industry? These are things that our viewers should pay attention to. It's not enough just to have a Twitter account, have a Facebook page, or a YouTube channel. It really is knowing how to communicate, when to communicate, and really listening too. Listening to what's being said, and that's so easily done today with hashtags. So.
And I would add, who's doing the communicating?
Exactly.
A lot of organizations have the receptionist or the secretary pushing out information because it's promotional. But in a crisis, you really don't want the receptionist or the secretary, regardless of how wonderful they are, leading your crisis communication strategy through social media.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add to that before I get to you, Greg, is that I also have said this many times on the show. I also don't want my junior social media coordinator at the controls of a crisis
Right.
situation. We've seen mistakes made over and over again, and we've also seen mistakes by omission. We've seen things not done because they don't realize it's a potential crisis. Greg, sorry, your turn. I want to get on this.
No, that's fine. Look, if you're a socially plugged in organization and you have a relationship with a large number of people through your social channels or through even a small number who happen to be very influential, then yes, you turn the knob on your social program when there's a crisis. Personally, my counsel is to make a distinction between trust-based messages and reporting-based messages. If you are reporting data, I try very hard to send people to third-party validated links. I want them reading mainstream media reports if at all possible. If they're messages that are heartfelt about, okay, we understand there's a problem, we're sorry for the loss of whatever, blah, 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 those are communicated directly. But I make those distinctions. However, if you're not a socially engaged organization, the absolute worst thing to do is to, man the ramparts on Twitter when a problem arises. Uh, you know, it will look bad, it will look candid, and it will look we don't want.
And I can piggyback on what Greg has said there. I think in a situation where you're not socially engaged, you will actually exacerbate the crisis, in my opinion, if suddenly you begin engaging. If you've had a dormant Twitter account for the last 6 months, or if you've never been on social media before and you suddenly create an account to push out a message, it's too little too late. You're basically trying to bail out the Titanic using a tin can.
Yeah, and it goes back to my point earlier in the show about planning when you're not in a crisis, and this social media has to be a component of that today. You really can't. It has to be a tool in the box. Make sure that you know who's going to send out those messages, and frankly, as the three of us know, I think it was you, Rod, who said the holding statements, and I've been talking about that for years. It's there's no reason why if you're in a certain industry and you don't. I mean, you can predict what the potential crisis situations are going to be. Not every single one, but if you look at just the things that we see on the news today, from workplace violence and active shooters and foodborne illnesses and the threat of terrorism, all these things, you could have, many crisis holding statements. In addition to that, in your particular industry, you may know of a brewing crisis in your industry or something in your trade organization is talking about. So these are always opportunities to soak up information, take early action. So when you're in a crisis, you are moving forward on the media relations side and on the social media side. And by the way, that's all the same today to me.
Very much.
I think we'd all agree. I mean, the idea of the word being social. So citizen journalism is the media today, because if they're getting sourced and they're getting reported in stories, and reporters are using citizen Twitter feeds to get sources of their stories, it's one big conglomerate. So it's a different world. So, okay. Any other thoughts on Secret Service, Ebola, anything else we talked about?
I think, just to piggyback on what you said before, I think the CDC and some of the local officials, they've done an excellent job. They're providing information that's helpful to the public. They're educating people about Ebola. I would argue maybe this information should have been coming out more readily. The media was certainly primed with everything we've seen in West Africa over the last few weeks. But I would say at this point, the communication is effective. There may be a lot of people talking, but it is effective.
Yeah. Good. Greg, anything?
To go back to the Secret Service, I have less a comment and more a prediction. Absolutely nothing done or said thus far or predictably done in the near-term future will change the culture and thus change the problems.
Yeah.
But I will see the public. I think you will see the public address the bicycle racks circling the White House. That we just simply won't stand for.
Yeah, and I would just say, certainly Secret Service is in the news today. IRS has been in the news other days, and other agencies where people have questioned the integrity, the culture, the honesty of different government agencies at any level. This is just another one in the news cycle, certainly. And I think for the reason I think that this is so magnified, the Secret Service story is so magnified today, is because we in the last few months have rightfully become concerned with the threat from ISIS and terrorism. We had the incident in Benghazi. So when you have, if you can't protect the White House, how are you going to protect us? How are you going to protect the citizens if you can't protect the leader of the free world? So I think certainly that would be my fear, So that's certainly a concern. Maybe they should just bring Clint Eastwood again, for the movie.
Or if Rick Perry's elected president, there's a high probability he'll pack heat. So it solves itself.
Well, open carry. A White House with open carry the policy. Huh? That could be. But what if he has a brain freeze when the guy, he needs to use the weapon? I don't know.
Well, the good news is in D.C. they're allowing everyone to carry weapons now, so everyone's packing heat in the Capitol.
Now that's going to be very interesting. And going back to Greg's point about data, I would love to see the data on crimes committed with a handgun in the next years. It'd be very interesting on the murder rate and the crime rate. So your point well taken about data. Anyway, Greg Brooks from the West Third of Las Vegas. Rod Hughes in the Philadelphia area from Kimball Communications. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Rich.
Great information for our viewers' benefit. Our website's www.thecrisisshow.com. You could also find us at The Crisis Show on Twitter. We also have a Facebook page called The Crisis Show, so we'd love to hear from you on any of those channels. Or you could add a comment to our YouTube channel or Google Plus as well. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Great content, great show. See you again soon. Have a great night, guys.
You too.
Take care.
Bye-bye.